I have pulled that emergency stop cord exactly once in my life, and after what I found waiting for me at the bottom of that shaft, I will never, under any circumstances, pull it again. My name is Dale Mercer. I am 51 years old, I have a bad knee, a worse back, and I operate the man cage elevator at the Blackridge No. 4 coal mine in eastern Kentucky. I have worked the night shift, 11 at night until 7 in the morning, for going on 9 years now. Most people don't even know this job exists anymore. They think everything underground is automated, computerized, run by machines and sensors and blinking lights on some supervisor's laptop screen. And maybe at some of the newer operations that's true. But Blackridge No. 4 is not a new operation. The shaft was sunk in 1947, the cage system was installed in 1953, and the man who trained me for this job, an old-timer named Garrett Pools who smelled permanently of coal dust and spearmint tobacco, told me on my very first night that this elevator had been carrying men down into the earth and bringing them back up for longer than either of us had been alive, and that it had opinions about how that should be done. I thought he was being poetic. I was wrong. Let me explain what a cage operator does, because most people picture an elevator like the kind in an office building. Push a button, doors slide open, soft music, maybe a mirror so you can check your hair. The man cage at a coal mine is nothing like that. It is a steel platform, roughly 8 feet by 10 feet, surrounded by a cage of heavy wire mesh, suspended on a steel cable as thick as my forearm, running down a vertical shaft that at Blackridge goes 1,400 feet straight into the earth. 3 levels surface, a middle level at 600 feet, and the deep level at 1,400. The cage doesn't have buttons. It has me. I stand at my station, a wooden booth about the size of a phone booth mounted on the surface platform, and I operate the hoist using a lever system. Up, down, speed, stop. I watch the depth indicators. I listen to the signal bells, and I control whether the men who work underground come back up or stay down there. That is a responsibility that never stops, sitting heavy on my chest, every single shift. But here's what I didn't understand when I took the job, what Garrett tried to explain to me, and what I only came to truly understand through 9 years of dark, cold, quiet nights. The rules at Blackridge No. 4 are not the rules you find in the mining company's official handbook. There is a second set of rules, an unofficial one. And every night operator who has ever worked this shaft knows them by heart, because the ones who didn't learn them didn't last. Garrett wrote them down for me on a piece of yellow legal paper the night he handed over the job. 14 rules. I have that paper still, folded in my jacket pocket every single night I come to work. The paper is soft as cloth now from being handled so many times. I will tell you the ones that matter most to this story. Rule 3, never operate the cage between 1:45 and 2:15 in the morning. If the cage is at surface when this window begins, leave it at surface. If it is below, leave it below. Do not move it. Do not respond to the signal bells if they ring during this window. Let them ring. Rule 7. If the cage returns to surface on its own during the night, log it. Do not touch the controls and wait for it to settle. It will settle. Give it time. Rule 9. The emergency stop pull cord runs inside the shaft at each level and inside the cage itself. If the emergency stop has been engaged from below, you will know because the indicator panel shows a pull from inside the cage versus a pull from a level station. You are to note the time, log the weight reading from the cable tension gauge, and do not, under any circumstances, send the cage back down until full daylight, meaning after 7 in the morning when the day shift supervisor is physically present on the platform. Rule 11, whatever you hear coming up the shaft, it is the wind. Blackridge shaft runs deep enough to connect with natural cave systems to the northeast. It is always the wind. Write that down and remember it. It is always the wind. Rule 14, which Garrett had written in heavier pencil than the others, pressing so hard it had almost torn the paper. If you see something in the cage when it arrives at surface, and that something looks back at you, do not run. Stand at your station. Keep your hand on the hoist lever. Keep the lights on. Do not run. He never explained Rule 14. Every time I asked, he changed the subject. And then one day Garrett Pools retired to a house in Florida, and I was alone with those rules in the dark and the shaft, and the sounds that were always the wind. For the first 2 years I worked nights at Blackridge. The shift was quiet in the way that most night shifts are quiet. Long stretches of nothing broken by the bells, signaling cage requests from the underground crew. Blackridge runs a small maintenance team on nights. 4 or 5 men doing equipment checks and ventilation work. And then the slow mechanical process of bringing the cage up or sending it down. I got used to the cold. The shaft breathes, did you know that? The air pressure changes as the cage moves through it, and the shaft breathes out at you from the top, a cold exhale that smells like deep rock and old water, and something underneath both of those things that I can only describe as ancient, like the smell of time itself. I got used to the breathing. I got used to the bells. I got used to the indicator lights, the tension readings on the cable gauge, the soft orange glow of the control booth instruments in the middle of the night. I got used to all of it. What I could not get used to, what no amount of time or familiarity made ordinary, was 2 o'clock in the morning. The first time I noticed it, I thought it was a coincidence. I was logging my 2 a.m. check. You fill out a status form every hour, cage position, crew location, any anomalies, and as I was writing, the signal bell rang. One ring from the deep level. One ring means the cage is requested. I looked at my watch. 2:03. I was inside the Rule 3 window. I set my pen down and I let it ring. It rang again, twice. 2 rings means acknowledge, I hear you, cage is coming. I didn't acknowledge. I sat on my hands, the way Garrett had told me to, in the one piece of advice that went beyond the written rules. When you're in that window and the bells ring, sit on your hands. Not because you'll forget the rules, because some part of you, some deep animal part that just wants to help, when something is asking for help, will move the lever before your brain catches up. The bells rang 7 more times over the next 4 minutes. Then they stopped. I sat in that booth with my hands under my thighs, and I watched the depth indicator needle, and I waited. And at 2:16, 1 minute after the window closed, the cable tension gauge spiked. Not the way it does when I engage the hoist. Not the smooth build of mechanical tension. It spiked suddenly like something had grabbed the cable from below. And then slowly, with no input from me, with my hands flat on the counter, and every light on the control panel burning steady with no mechanical activity indicated, the depth needle began to move. The cage was coming up, on its own. 1,400 feet is a long way. Even at maximum hoist speed, which is what the gauge told me it was moving at, it takes several minutes. I sat absolutely still and I watched that needle climb, and I thought about Rule 7. If the cage returns to surface on its own, log it. Do not touch the controls. Wait for it to settle. And I held on to Rule 7 the way a drowning man holds a rope. I said it out loud. I actually said it out loud to myself in that empty booth. Log it. Do not touch the controls. Wait for it to settle. The cage settled into the surface dock at 2:21 in the morning. The mechanical locks engaged automatically. The indicator board showed cage at surface, emergency stop engaged from inside cage, cable tension. And here is where I stopped breathing. Cable tension reading consistent with a load of approximately 400 pounds. I pressed my face against the booth glass and I looked at the cage. It was empty. Every light on the platform was burning. I could see the cage clearly through the mesh, the steel floor, the mesh walls, the overhead bar where the cable attaches. Nothing inside. Nobody inside. 400 pounds of nothing inside a cage built to hold 12 men. I wrote it in the log, every word of it. Cage returned to surface unassisted at 02:21. Emergency stop engaged from interior of cage. Cable tension indicating load of approximately 400 lubbies. Cage confirmed visually empty. I wrote it in the small, careful handwriting I use when my hands are shaking and I need them not to show it on the page. And then I sat there until 7 in the morning and I did not send that cage back down. That was the first time. I want you to understand that it was not the last time. It happens every night. Every single night at Blackridge, somewhere between 2 a.m. and 2:30 a.m., that cage comes up from the deep level on its own, emergency stop pulled from the inside, carrying 400 pounds of nothing that I cannot see and cannot explain, and per Rule 9, cannot investigate until full daylight with another person present. I've tried to rationalize it. Cable tension gauges can drift in cold environments. The shaft temperature at the deep level runs around 52 degrees year round, and the surface can be much colder in winter. And temperature differentials affect metal fatigue and gauge calibration. I've told myself that. The mine supervisor, a man named Holt who is perfectly nice and perfectly useless in every way that matters on the night shift, told me that when I reported it to him in my first year. Calibration drift, he said. Common in older shafts, nothing to worry about. He said this in the bright middle of the afternoon in his warm office, and I nodded and drove home and did not sleep, because here is what a calibration drift does not explain. It does not explain the emergency stop being pulled from the inside of the cage. That is not a gauge. That is a physical cord, a bright red cord with a wooden handle, mounted inside the cage on the wall, and pulling it mechanically engages a braking system that locks the cable in place. You cannot get a false reading on that. Either the cord has been pulled or it hasn't. And every morning when the day shift supervisor and I reset the cage for the morning run, that cord is pulled. Every morning, without exception. And there is something else. Something I have never written in any official log and never told Holt and never told anyone except one other person, which I will get to. After the cage settles and the locks engage and I have confirmed visually that the cage is empty, I hear something. From the shaft, rising up from that 1,400-foot column of dark air. Rule 11 says it is always the wind. I have heard wind my entire life. I grew up in the mountains. I know what wind sounds like moving through rock and narrow spaces and underground chambers. I know the sound of wind. What comes up that shaft at 2:20 in the morning is not wind. It is rhythmic. It has cadence. Some nights it is almost too faint to hear, and I convince myself I am imagining it. Other nights, cold nights when the shaft is breathing harder than usual, it comes up clearly enough that I have, against every instinct of professionalism and self-preservation, pressed my ear against the mesh gate of the cage dock and listened. It sounds like counting. Slow, low, in a register at the bottom edge of what a human voice can produce, and I cannot make out numbers and I cannot make out words, and I tell myself I am not hearing counting. I tell myself it is the way wind breaks across the lip of the shaft and creates oscillating tones, the way blowing across a bottle makes a note. I tell myself this on the drive home. I tell myself this in the shower. I tell myself this lying awake at noon staring at my ceiling. I keep telling myself. The one person I told about the counting was a man named Phil Ackers who worked the 4 to midnight shift and handed off to me. Phil was a talker, which I appreciated, because the handoff was the only human conversation I got all night. We stood on the platform one December evening while he was pulling his coat on, and I told him about the rhythm in the shaft, and he stopped buttoning his coat and looked at me for a long moment. "What does it sound like?" he asked. I said I couldn't tell. Like a voice counting very slowly in a very low register. Phil finished buttoning his coat. He picked up his bag. He looked at me one more time and he said, "Don't count back." Then he left. I called him the next day to ask what he meant. He said he didn't know what I was talking about. Said he didn't remember saying it. He was not a convincing liar, Phil Ackers. His voice was too flat and too careful and his denial was too fast. I didn't push it. There are things at Blackridge that push back when you push them, and I had learned by then to recognize which things those were. 3 months ago, I had the worst night of my 9 years at that mine. It was a Tuesday in January. Maintenance crew was small that night, only 2 men, Dwyer and a new hire named Castillo who'd been on nights for maybe 6 weeks. I brought them down to the middle level at 11:30, and the plan was they'd work the ventilation crosscut through the night and signal for the cage around 5:30 for surface return. Standard rotation. At 1:50 I started my pre-window routine. I verified cage position, middle level where I'd left it after dropping the crew, logged my check, refilled my coffee, sat down. At 1:58 the signal bell rang, 3 rings. 3 rings is emergency, bring the cage now, do not wait. I looked at my watch. 1:58. The window started at 1:45. I was inside the Rule 3 window, and the emergency bell was ringing from the middle level. This is the part of the story where you might say, well, obviously you sent the cage down, 2 of your crew were in danger. And every single human instinct I had was screaming exactly that at me for the 30 seconds I sat there with my hand not on the lever. 30 seconds is not very long. 30 seconds is an eternity when men you know might be in trouble 600 feet below your boots and you are not moving. The bell rang again. 3 rings. Again. 3 rings. Rule 3. Garrett had never given me an exception for emergencies. He had never said, well, if someone is hurt, you can break Rule 3. He had written it flat and absolute. Do not operate the cage during this window. Do not respond to the signal bells if they ring during this window. Let them ring. I pressed my back against the booth wall, and I sat on my hands and I let them ring. The bells rang 11 times in the next 8 minutes. At 2:14, 1 minute before the window ended, they stopped. At 2:16, the cable tension spiked. The cage came up from the middle level this time, not the deep level. That was different. It was always the deep level. Middle level was where my crew was. The needle tracked up from 600 feet, and my eyes went between the depth indicator and the booth window, and the tension gauge and the emergency stop indicator. And everything was happening the same way it always happened. Emergency stop pulled from inside the cage. Tension reading of 400 pounds, cage rising at maximum speed, and it docked its surface at 2:23. I looked through the booth glass. In the center of the cage floor there was a hard hat. One hard hat lying on its side, orange, with a piece of black electrical tape on the front where you write your name. Castillo wore an orange hard hat. I had seen him put the tape on it on his first week. Behind me, from the shaft, rising up clearly and slowly through 2:23 in the morning, that rhythm, that low cadence, closer than I had ever heard it, as if whatever made it had ridden up from the middle level and was now right below the surface dock, somewhere in those first few feet of shaft, just under the platform where I was standing. I did not press my ear to the cage mesh. I stood at my station. I kept my hand on the hoist lever. I kept every light burning. I did not run Rule 14. Whatever was in the cage when it arrived at surface, and whatever was now sitting just below me in the top of that shaft, it had looked at me through the mesh. And I had met its gaze, and I had not moved. And after approximately 4 minutes, the tension reading dropped to 0, and the rhythm faded back down the shaft until it was gone. The hard hat was still on the cage floor. Dyer and Castillo arrived at the surface dock at 5:47 a.m. when I sent the cage down at first light. Both of them were fine. I watched them step off the platform, and I wanted to ask Castillo about his hard hat, and I couldn't make myself do it. He was wearing it. Orange, black tape, his name written in marker. Wearing it on his head. I have not looked inside the cage on any morning since then to check if there is anything on the floor. I am at work right now. It is 12:40 a.m. on a Tuesday. The crew is at the deep level, 3 men tonight, and the cage is down there with them, sitting at 1,400 feet. In 1 hour and 5 minutes, I will begin my pre-window routine. In 1 hour and 25 minutes, Rule 3 goes into effect. In approximately 1 hour and 45 minutes, give or take, the cable tension will spike. The cage will come up. The emergency stop will be pulled from the inside. Something that weighs 400 pounds and cannot be seen will ride up 1,400 feet in the dark. And I will stand at my station with my hand on the hoist lever and every light burning, and I will not run, and I will wait for it to settle. And I will write it in the log in my small, careful handwriting, and then I will sit in this booth until 7 in the morning. Because that is the job. That is the job. And Garrett Pools knew what the job was when he gave it to me, and whoever gave it to Garrett knew, and whoever came before them knew, and going back to 1953, when this cage was first hung in this shaft, somebody has been sitting in this booth at 2 in the morning and doing exactly what I am doing right now. Keeping the lights on, keeping their hand on the lever, not running. I think about Rule 14 most on nights like tonight, when I have too much time and too much quiet, and the shaft is breathing steadily at me, and I can feel the weight of everything that is underground pressing up against the surface where I sit. I think about Garrett writing those words in heavy pencil. If you see something in the cage when it arrives at surface, and that something looks back at you, do not run. He had seen something. He had seen something look back at him, and he had not run, and he had worked this job for 22 years before retiring to Florida, and he was still alive as far as I knew. That meant following the rules worked. It meant the rules were not arbitrary. Somebody had learned them the hard way, maybe a long line of somebody stretching back 70 years, and they had written them down and passed them forward, and the rules were protection, which means the thing in the cage is real. I check my watch, 12:51. The shaft breathes, somewhere 1,400 feet below me. 3 men who trust me with their lives are working in the dark. I pull the yellow legal paper from my jacket pocket, unfold it, and read all 14 rules from top to bottom the way I do every night when the window is getting close. My handwriting in the margins adding context over 9 years. Small notes, reminders. The paper so soft it's almost translucent now. At 1:45 I will sit on my hands. I will let the bells ring, I will wait. If you work underground, if you work nights, if you have ever sat in the small circle of your own lights while the rest of the world is dark and felt the particular quality of attention that darkness pays to you. You already know what I mean when I say that some places have rules for a reason, and the reason is not one that will ever appear in any safety manual. Stay at your station. Keep the lights on. Do not run. And whatever you do, do not count back. If you work a night shift job alone, have you ever noticed something that the rules told you to ignore and followed those rules anyway without knowing why?